now I feel kind of bad. I prepared something that I was actually going to read, and I'm gonna go ahead and do that. But now they did such a great job of speaking extemporaneously that I hope I can follow. Hope it's not too boring by comparison. Anyhow, so I'm coming from a composition perspective, and from a composition perspective, I was most interested in Adichie's account of a student who, after reading her novel, told her that it was a shame that Nigerian men were physically abusive. Having no other stories of Nigerian life to draw upon, the student assumed that the father character in the book was representative of all Nigerian men. This led Adichie to reflect on how, although she had read American Psycho, she never imagined that its main character was an embodiment of American men in general. Having read authors like Updike, Steinbeck, and Gaskell, she explains that she was well aware that not all Americans were serial killers. She then briefly acknowledges how this imbalance of awareness is the result of an uneven distribution of power around the globe, which has given certain voices in cultures greater platforms than others. However, this is one of the few places where she acknowledges the role that power plays in determining the type of stories that can be told, the manner in which they're told, who is authorized to tell them, and how they get distributed. So I guess I'd like to take this opportunity to extend this conversation a little further by examining how these issues intersect with scholarship and rhetoric and composition. Specifically, I'd like to investigate how the demand for clarity in writing, which is taken for granted as a goal of effective writing instruction, often conceals similarly oppressive power structures that actively prevent minority voices, the voices of others, from expressing themselves and getting their stories heard. In the foreword to a collection of essays entitled Representations Doing Asian American Rhetoric, Minzong Liu and Bruce Horner describe how standard American English has become an instrument of cultural imperialism. They argue that because correct English is considered to be the, quote, language of American truth, and therefore the truth of the technologically developed world, it is currently being used by international organizations such as the World Bank to constrain life in developing or underdeveloped worlds, end quote. Take, for example, the events surrounding the 2008 Beijing Olympics, quote. For the privilege to host the Olympics, there was a requirement that all road or shop signs in the city had to include an English translation, end quote. This forced many business owners to rely on computer software in order to translate their business names. In one noteworthy case, it was reported that a fast food restaurant mistakenly posted a sign out front that said, "No translation" or "server error." Now, on the surface, this might seem like nothing more than a humorous anecdote. However, it can also be read as a consequence of America's ostensible right to, quote, enjoy global access without having to sweat over the learning of another language, end quote. Believing our worldview to be an expression of truth, we often fail to see the oppression that results when we insist that others conform to our language and lifestyle. Now, in the most recent February 2010 issue of the academic journal College Composition and Communication, Ian Bernard maintains that the demand for students to produce clear writing is based on a similar ideology. In order to illustrate this point, he cites a 2001 article from David Orr entitled Verbicide. In this article, Orr complains that clarity is suffering because we are no longer, quote, held together as we once were by the reading of a common literature or by listening to great stories. And so we cannot draw on a common set of metaphors and images as we once did. Allusions to the Bible and other great books no longer resonate because they are simply unfamiliar to a growing number of people, end quote. Although it's not exactly what he intended us to take from it, Orr's statement reveals how clarity is much more than a scientific or mere technical matter. In fact, this statement demonstrates that it's largely about shared cultural realities, the Bible, a common literature, shared metaphors, idioms, etc. Therefore, it is apparent that anyone who wishes to speak in a language ends up being interpolated by its particular and pre-existing symbol system. Yet as Frank Chin, Jeffrey Chen, Lawson Nada, and Sean Wong explain, quote, the minority experience does not yield itself to accurate or complete expression in a white man's language. Yet the minority writer is made to feel morally obligated to write in a language produced by an alien and hostile sensibility. His task is to codify his experience in the form of prior symbols, cliches, linguistic mannerisms, and a sense of humor that appeals to whites. Otherwise, the story is end quote, Otherwise, the story is likely to be ignored or marginalized due to its, quote, unclear nature. Hence, while Adichie may encourage us to produce and consume a more diverse array of stories, it appears that this won't get us far unless we also learn to negotiate the power structures which govern the way that these stories are circulated and told. So, a step in the right direction might involve thinking more about what we mean when we ask our students to write more clearly. After all, if we want to accept Adichie's challenge to move past the danger of a single story, then maybe we also need to have the patience to carefully interpret the complexity and ambiguity of student and minority discourses, the same as we would published authors like, say, James Joyce. As Chinua Achebe has said, quote, "The price that a world language must be prepared to pay is submission to many different kinds of use," end quote. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. Our next panelist speaking is Miriam Fernandez.
I also prepared something. There are a few things that I would like to touch upon in this speech. One is regarding the incompleteness that single stories create, and the second is the idea that multiple stories can empower. One of the things that I've struggled with in the field of literature is the exclusivity of the American literature canon. Now, thankfully, we have a subfield of American literature that we call multi-ethnic or multicultural. That allows us to see multiple stories that exist. My problem with this, however, is that by creating a subfield of American literature, we're not really including multicultural American literature. We are, in a sense, marginalizing it, excluding it. What happens when we have budget issues, or when we have class cuts, or when we have class requirements that force us to take classes around a single story? I think what inevitably happens is the cutting of these classes that have the potential of breaking the single story of American literature. The canon of American literature has become synonymous with dead old white males. And if the canon is represented in this way, it also gives us the impression that there is only one American story, or one American experience. The reality of it, however, is that there are multiple experiences, and thus multiple American stories. We need to stop exoticizing these experiences, these stories, and start including them within the canon of American literature as valid, legitimate experiences. Creating this exclusivity around the canon gives us an incomplete story of the American experience, one that is governed by power hierarchies. Power hierarchies that continue to oppress Americans today. There's not only one American experience, there are many. There are people who experience racism, sexism, homophobia. There are people who exist in both marginalized and dominant spaces. And if we ignore those stories, then we also ignore the things that make this country great, the diversity in it. It may not be a diversity that is wholeheartedly accepted and welcomed, but it is still a diversity that exists, that is valid and legitimate, and as such deserves a place within the canon. Students of literature have a right to see characters that they relate to, not as an exception to the normal American experience, but in fact as a legitimate part of it. We have to empower ourselves by validating the multiple stories that exist. By labeling multicultural American experiences as exotic, special exceptions, or in the category of extra elective classes, we in a sense ensure a cycle of oppression. I do not deny that the classic American literature is worth studying, but I do rebel against the idea that it is the only valid literature worth studying, that anything else exists outside of the canon, because the truth is that these stories not only exist within, but they also make the American experience. So I guess I would just like to end by saying that American literature is not dead. It's vibrant, it's living, it's growing, and it's growing with multiple stories that deserve to be